within Afro-Arabo-pean framed films set in present-day France. And within this context, I'm going to touch very briefly on the work of Rachid Jaidani and his film Rangan, released in France in 2012, and Hicham Ayouch's Fevers, a France-Morocco co-production released in 2013. These films underscore that place and origin are no longer exclusive markers of identity, even if they still play vital roles in many people's self-reading. They employ cinematic techniques that create delocalized, fluid spaces in which character identities are shaped by selective and multiple affinities to colonial culture, ancestral culture, and adopted cultures. Identities are no longer constructed in opposition to or in reaction to another force. The relational model of identity is highly inflected with openness to diversity and dialogue. The term Afropolitan has been proposed to foreground the notion that identity is always in motion, with one of its key proponents, Achille Mbembe, defining this state as, quote, a way of being African, open to difference and conceived as transcending race, end quote. Mbembe considers this process to be incomplete and subject to, quote, tensions and contradictions, end quote, but sees this as a present and future state that will redefine how the world sees Africa and, in turn, how Africa sees the world. Chiolozona Eze would also agree here, claiming that the situation is not perfect, but that Afropolitanism does allow one to grasp the diverse nature of being African or of African descent in the world today. Here, the Afropolitan circulates within the larger cosmopolitan context of humanity, bypassing, in a sense, the politics of location and specific geographies. Is there an inherent danger here of glossing over specific histories of oppression, but also histories of achievement, allowing others to index lives? Eze's insight into Afropolitanism within the more global movement of cosmopolitanism opens a fruitful space for considering films such as Fevers and Rangan. Borrowing the term moral topography from Charles Taylor, Eze opens up its use beyond the ways in which Taylor saw the Western sense of self, evolving over time, to now include a sense of becoming an interconnectedness with others beyond skin color. The African interconnected moral self is the self in conversation with the other. Eze still sees Afropolitans as rooted geographically and through specific communities, but now these communities are, as she puts it, polychromatic, polymorphic, diverse, and open. Other recent frameworks for describing experiences and states of being African-European or Afro-European include migritude and Afro-peanness, terms deployed most often within the context of literary production. Afro-pean authors, for example, write in French and deal with the thorny issue of navigating both African and European spaces, identities, and thought patterns. As John Nimis has argued, quote, the term Afro-pean has become useful given that it incorporates the term European, which designates a post-national economic community, the EU, while also referring to whites as a racial category. For the prefix Euro is substituted Afro, which, like Euro, refers to both a continent, i.e. a larger than national formation, and a racial category. Afro-peanism is thus more grounded in this duality than more universalizing terms such as negritude or the more recent Afropolitan, end quote. Nimis further elaborates that being Afro-pean involves seamless mixing and movement across spaces and distances, but also across imagined categories of humans, black and white. Sub-Saharan African-born authors such as Fatou Diome, Lauren Ecue, and Alain Mbankaku grapple with themes pertaining to their communities in France, but always from different gender, class, or national perspectives, making it impossible, according to Dominique Thomas, to apply any sort of schematic to the overall corpus of work being produced. Here I would ask, is there a way past the hyphenated identity of Afro this or that, indexes deemed threatening, as Nikki Hitchcock describes it, to European national identities? Gilroy provides some insight when he opines that, quote, we need to conjure up a future in which Black Europeans stop being seen as migrants. Migrancy becomes doubly unhelpful when it alone supplies an explanation for the conflicts and opportunities of this transnational moment in the life of Europe's polities, economics, and cultural ensemble, end quote. It would seem here that migratude might provide a useful entry point to the dilemma of identity construction in transnational contexts. Dominique Thomas has pointed out that there are critical and theoretical precursors to Afro-peanism, most notably migratude, which seems to bundle together notions of both immigrant and expatriate belongings. Thomas attributes the term to Jacques Chevrier, who first used the term to explain how the early 20th century cultural and philosophical precepts of negritude could be linked with African migration to France later in the same century. This concept, however, along with that of Afrique sur scène, deployed by Odile Cazenave in 2003 to denote immigrant sub-Saharan African authors who have turned their focus away from their continent of birth toward France, almost exclusively, seem to place most emphasis on the expatriate status of the authors. I would argue that these tropes, although important for the framing and exploration of much literary production, fall short of fully describing and assessing the relational spaces and positions occupied by all Afro-descendants, i.e. persons of African ancestry in Europe. They all posit Africa as source, but they seem to only designate persons of sub-Saharan African or Caribbean origin, thus privileging blackness as a category and striving for a black French presence fully recognized by the French nation-state. Furthermore, migratude conjures up notions of roaming and wandering like a flaneur, as if the protagonist is not sure which direction she or he should take, an aimless wanderer, so to speak, with the luxury of living a nomadic lifestyle. I do, however, agree with Thomas that Afro-pean literary production has been successful in, quote, the vibrancy, ingenuity, creativity, and capacity of protagonists to imagine the contours of a diverse and inclusive France, and the ways in which the concerns and objectives of Afro-peans are inseparable from the broader project of Europeanization, and of Europeans' own reckoning with colonial history, its legacy, and the multiple configurations of expanded 21st century identities, end quote. The terms keep evolving into ever new descriptions of experiences, which in and of themselves are not new. Racial discrimination, as a result of French colonialism, is a constant reminder and a constant marker of what one is not, regardless of which name one takes on. Here, the work of Moroccan thinker Abdelkebir Ratibi might help provide another way forward. His work links very closely with that of Edouard Glissant, since it deals with cultural plurality and relationality created by colonialism. But he cautions that multiple differences must necessarily result from varying engagement with the effects of colonialism in the Maghreb. Ratibi conceives of a plural Maghreb, which he imagines as a layering of Derrida's thinking on deconstruction with that of decolonization to account for multiple differences in multiple languages. So, in other words, linguistic relationality within the Maghreb. In his landmark study entitled Maghreb Pluriel from 1983, he maps out his idea of plural thinking and pensée autre to explore what he considers the multiple differences which constitute the Maghreb. He proposes a dismissal of European society from the Maghreb, reminiscent of Fanon, and argues for a process of identity construction that always calls itself into question, while acknowledging the limitations of simply embracing Western influence, the undesirability of a return to source, and the necessity of exploring the rich multiplicity of differences that constitute the Maghreb. Ultimately, Ratibi champions a process of bilingualism as an open-ended exchange between cultures and languages, but which carries with it something of the untranslatable. I ask then, what happens when we gather all the threads of diaspora, exile, migritude, Afro-peanness, Afropolitanism, relationality, and pensée autre together? Can we create a framework for understanding creative relationalities of being Afro-Arabian in present-day France, and perhaps by extension the globe? Valerie Orlando has very aptly extended the work of Ratibi and others in her analysis of the Afropolitanism in the writings of Moroccan authors Youssouf Amin al-Lamani and Fouad Lahoui. She argues that they espouse a being in the world which promotes movement forward to engage in becoming something other than the pessimistic stereotype associated with Morocco, as well as the African continent. Orlando, building on Ratibi, sees cultures as fluid and relational, and this analysis helps steer the debate in the direction of fluidity and movement in 21st century being in the world. In 2012, the filmmaker and novelist Rashid Jaidani completed his first feature fiction film, Rangan, which is also known as Refrain, which took 9 years to make on a shoestring budget. The film was described by Remy Yassine in El Watan as the Barbès version of Romeo and Juliet. But I believe it is really a modern-day tale that goes beyond a love story to probe the right to social, political, and cultural self-determination, as well as personal responsibility within integration in contemporary French society. Ostensibly focused on the couple of Dorsey, a young Black African actor struggling to survive through his art, and Sabrina, a French Maghrebi woman, the film depicts their resolve to marry despite varying opposition from members of the respective Catholic and Muslim families. This mixed cultural terrain is not unfamiliar to Jaidani, himself the product of a Sudanese Algerian mother and Algerian father, who grew up in the Yvelines area outside Paris. Similarly, Hicham Ayouch was born in Paris in 1976 to a French Jewish mother of Tunisian origin and a Moroccan father who happens to be a close confidant of the current King Mohammed VI of Morocco. His third feature, Fevers, begins with extreme close-ups of an adolescent boy, Benjamin, insisting to an off-screen social worker that he will go and live with his father now that his mother is in prison. This decision unleashes a series of disconcerting scenes, probing established notions of integration, family, home, and father and son relationships. Benjamin's father, Karim, is an unmarried laborer who lives with his parents, Algerian immigrants Zora and Abdelkader Zeroubi, in the Parisian suburb of Noisy-le-Sec. With Rangan and Fevers, Jaidani and Ayouch are committed to exploring the relational interplay between French, Maghrebi, and African imperatives, staking out an affiliative and relational narrative structure in which each of the characters evidences an individual engagement with their culture, history, and global influences. In both films, the narrative structure provides a case in point for relationality. The major story or narrative strands and thematic issues are laid out in the film's respective expositions. First, we have second and third generation Maghrebi and sub-Saharan African immigrants as workers in the metropole. Second, we have mixed marriage discourse, including how, as Michel Cadet puts it, quote, to distinguish between religious values and what is simply a matter of tradition, end quote. And third, integrationist discourse, including the interplay of ethnic origins in a purportedly egalitarian republic such as France. These strands appear simple in and of themselves, but in fact are woven very tightly together in the film underscoring what Will Higbee has described as, quote, the impossibility of separating personal religious belief from individual and collective interaction in the socio-economic sphere, end quote. The rise of the working class in France was bolstered by immigration during the 19th and 20th centuries. During its economic crisis in the 1970s, France allowed a significant influx of immigrants to permanently settle and obtain citizenship. One result of this in the larger urban areas was high unemployment rates amongst immigrants. Nadia Kiwan has shown that in contemporary France, from 2002 to 2005, cultural discrimination is more of a determining factor in higher unemployment trends of Algerian origin youth than those of other cultural groups, because of lingering memories of the Algerian War of Independence, as well as a general discomfort with Islamic cultures. In Rangan, Slimane, whose character acts as the major blocking force to the young couple's quest to get married, is confronted by a blocking force to his own actions. Many of his brothers seem to have integrated and are imbued in varying degrees with values of liberty and free choice, and are not interested in preventing Sabrina's marriage. Dorsey also encounters resistance from his family, who considers Sabrina white and a foreigner. Thus, two communities live side by side but rarely mix or intermarry, individual desire eclipsed by collective will. This touche pas à ma sœur attitude is underscored with irony in an early scene in which one of Sabrina's brothers breaks the Ramadan fast with his black friend and explains the family's quote-unquote dilemma, expecting his friend to understand. The mood at the beginning of the scene is one of easygoing camaraderie, with Sabrina's brother teaching his friend the prayer in both Arabic and French, and then sharing his dates as they break their fast. The tone begins to shift as her brother describes Dorsey as one of yours. The friend is incredulous at the implication that because he himself is black and of sub-Saharan origin, he should therefore know Dorsey. Africa is a continent, not a country. Sabrina's brother retorts, why did she have to choose a black? Know what I'm saying? He goes on to complain that because Dorsey is a non-Muslim black, he wouldn't be presentable to the family. His friend begins to turn away in disgust, exclaiming, who did you eat with last night? Who showed you hospitality? Sabrina's brother retorts, it's not the same. Your family's different. It's not their color, it's their heart. The argument escalates as the friend asks, and if I wanted to marry Sabrina, what would you say? Sabrina's brother exclaims, nothing to say. The answer's no. The friend walks away in disgust, ordering Sabrina's brother to move in the opposite direction, the latter whining, no need to get in a sweat. Cinematically, the friends are depicted in medium and medium close-up two shots and framed either side by side facing the camera or in over-the-shoulder shots. Thus, character space is linked here but disrupted by the mobile camera, which hovers like a nervous hummingbird moving back and forth between the two friends, beginning in mostly low angle, as though it is trying to perch on their shoulders, but ending in a slightly high angle long shot of Sabrina's brother, back to the camera walking slowly into the cityscape. Is Jaidani suggesting that this unresolved interaction is the refrain of the film's title, simply the same old story of racism? This scene cleverly frames the exclusionary practices at work in French nation and identity building. Jaidani further complicates his narrative with layers of irony by exposing the relationship of Slimane with his Jewish girlfriend, Nina, whom he considers the love of his life and with whom he has promised to marry. Kept secret for fear of reprisal by his brothers on religious and racial grounds, Slimane's relationship and attitude embodies perhaps the most hypocritical stance of the whole film. You are Arab when you want to be, exclaims Sabrina to one of her other brothers, who also opposes her marriage. In Fevers, Abdelkader is shocked when he hears his grandson's name, which is obviously Jewish. Benjamin's integration into the family is rocky at best. Abdelkader's discipline and punish views on child rearing clash with Karim's patience and desire to understand his son as he commits a series of delinquent acts, smoking, drinking beer, tagging the apartment block's walls and doors with red spray paint, burning the family Quran, breaking the maquette of the family's homestead in the Maghreb. Benjamin's actions violate the Muslim beliefs of his blood family, who themselves seem to have not fully integrated into French society. Interestingly, after the maquette is broken, Benjamin and his grandfather repair it together, a possible metaphor for the route to tolerance, the newly possible chez soi, hospitality, which does not depend on national identity debates. The crisis point comes midway through the film when Benjamin attempts to stab his father and the two scuffle on the apartment balcony as Benjamin taunts Karim to push him over the edge. Karim realizes what he is doing and begs his son's forgiveness. From this moment on, the family embarks on a journey of tolerance and understanding, albeit on tenterhooks. Most importantly, they begin to lay bare previously unspoken truths. For example, after discovering his son's gift for painting, Karim takes him to visit his institutionalized brother Hekel and admits to Benjamin that he caused the accident that incapacitated his brother. This confession sheds light on two previous scenes about father-son relationships and masculinity. For example, at the beginning of the film, a shamefaced Karim confesses to Abdelkader that he didn't know he had a son, and Abdelkader tells him to be a man. Similarly, Benjamin challenges his father's manhood when he attempts to hit Karim's boss, and they are both lectured about punishment by the boss. Afterward, Karim is livid with Benjamin, shouting that the child's actions have put his livelihood in jeopardy. Benjamin retorts, "You are not a man." Ayush is underscoring that this is a film as much about responsibility as it is about tolerance. In Fevers, many scenes are shot in closed form using blue and gray filters, with characters trapped in bleak prison-like spaces between the vertical lines of the HLM. Even when the Zeroubi family begins to bond and explore difference, Ayush still makes use of vertical architecture, sometimes reframing to link the character space of Karim and Benjamin during the last half of the film, creating a visual metaphor for father and son united against the world. In one scene, Ayush infuses light touches of humor as Benjamin, his father, and grandparents abandon the dining room table and are lined up on chairs on the apartment balcony, backs to the camera, each eating a slice of pizza and discussing the fact that the family would never before have considered eating pizza or allowed Benjamin to eat pork. If this is truly a film about tolerance, Ayush is telling us there is still much work to be done. In conclusion, both Rongan and Fevers interrogate notions of hospitality and what it means to be chez soi in a French metropolis rife with national identity debates. Being at home means being in the world, back to Valerie Orlando, and is about liberty and the freedom of choice to create and innovate through unfettered imagination, forever in construction.
This is a piece from my dissertation, so I might go a little quickly through things, and I'm always looking to workshop it, so comments, please, are much appreciated. At the turn of the 21st century, several key texts were published that marked an evolution of Boer literature to Banlieue literature. These texts, of which Rachid Jaidani's 1999 novel Boomkeur and Faizagen's 2004 novel Kief Kief Demain are likely the best known examples, exemplify a different style of writing about the banlieue, a term which translates to suburbs but is nonetheless typically reserved for the economically disadvantaged neighborhoods on the outskirts of French cities. Several critics have sought to define this 21st century writing style. Dominique Thomas defines it as that which, quote, exposes social injustice and equality, and in doing so effectively records the part of society that has previously either been ignored or deductively represented by outsiders, end quote. Other critics, including Nina Bucker and Christina Horvath, speak of a kind of urban novel that includes but is not unique to the banlieue, that combines references to different artistic mediums with strong roots in a particular city. At the intersection of these various definitions lies what I am calling the polyphonic banlieue novel, a novel that engages with debates surrounding integration in France through a polyphonic style of writing that both showcases the extent to which these authors and their characters have absorbed French references, while simultaneously redirecting the conversation away from race. Through my reading of Rachid Santaki's autofictive novel, La Petite Cité dans la Prairie, I will argue that Santaki's polyphonic writing blends references to various genres and elements of popular culture to create a new form of identity that is not based in racial politics. I will conclude with a discussion of the political implications of polyphony as a response to integration. Before I get to these arguments, it is necessary to define both banlieue literature and polyphony a bit more precisely. In 2007, several authors of banlieue literature, among them Jaidani, Gens, and Santaki, collaborated to write a manifesto titled Qui fait la France, in which they defined what banlieue writing meant for them. The title, which evokes the homonymic phrase Qui fait la France, a commonly used neologism that means to love or be crazy about something or someone, neatly sums up their mission: to demonstrate that, in their racial and ethnic diversity, they are representative of the people who make up present-day France, and that they simultaneously have a great deal of love for France. As Thomas correctly notes, this message is all the more powerful in that it contradicts a dominant analysis of the 2005 riots, which attributes them to an unwillingness of ethnic minorities to integrate into French society. Indeed, banlieue writing in general, and the polyphonic banlieue novel specifically, reaffirms a feeling by its authors and characters that they are French. These banlieue novels focus more on the multiracial aspects of the banlieue, downplaying the author's own ethnic identity, and, perhaps most significantly, shift the conversation from one between the periphery of France and its metropolitan center to one which engages with an international, globalizing community. The banlieue novel both proudly affirms the Frenchness of its characters while simultaneously presenting, through the style of polyphony, a vision of France where multiple identities, languages, and voices are equally valued. I define polyphony as it appears in the polyphonic banlieue novel as the presence of multiple elements, that is to say genres, languages, points of view, historical events, bodies, and cultures, all of which are given equal weight within the work of art that precludes a finalizing discourse. My definition builds on Bakhtin's original definition of polyphony, which he views as a plurality of, quote, independent and unmerged voices and consciousnesses with equal rights and each with its own world, end quote, while expanding the possibility for these voices and consciousness beyond the thoughts or feelings of specific characters to an understanding which allows for these voices to be different languages, different genres, or different cultural references. Polyphony, which was a musical term before Bakhtin co-opted it, refers to the simultaneous presence of multiple melodies within a single song. I build on this concept of the harmonious combination of multiple melodies to see polyphony as a plurality of genres and voices, some literal, differentiated languages existing within a single work. The element of harmony is key here. This combination of genres does not create dissonance, but rather a rich symphony created by the successful unification of these seemingly disparate elements. Like Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's rhizomes, these differentiated chords create a non-hierarchical web of significations that can disconnect and reconnect, folding into one another and creating new meanings in the process. Given the multi-generic nature of a polyphonic piece of writing, it should come as no surprise that polyphony frequently traverses generic boundaries, as authors often adapt the same project across multiple formats in order to reach a wider audience. Indeed, if we look at the authors of polyphonic banlieue novels, all have worked across multiple genres, from film to music to the novel. Variations on polyphony have long been applied to Francophone North African literature, a recognized precursor to and influence on both Beur and banlieue literature. Indeed, polyphony, through the inclusion of reference and allusions to multiple cultures, countries, genres, languages, and literary canons, was a common aspect of many Francophone North African novels, Tahar Ben-Jelloun's Harouda, Assia Jabal's La Soif, and Kateb Yassin's Nejma, among many others. The polyphonic Francophone North African novel has also often been linked to the creation of a new nation. For an example, we need look no further than Yassin's Nejma, whose eponymous protagonist is often interpreted as the symbol of a new post-colonial Algerian nation. Through my case study of Santaki's novel, I aim to show how authors of the polyphonic Banlieue novel likewise employ polyphony, albeit of a different, less stylized high modernist variety, to accomplish the same goal of creating a space that embraces and encourages multiple cultural perspectives and reference. They adapt the polyphonic strategies of authors of the Maghrebi authors who came before them to represent their own experiences in the banlieue. The polyphonic Banlieue novel thus acts as an updated method of textual resistance against a hegemonic characterization of the post-colonial banlieue subject. The authors of the polyphonic Banlieue novel create an imagined community where difference and multiple identities are celebrated and validated. I will now turn to Santaki's 2008 autofictive novel, La Petite Cité dans la Prairie, which roughly translates as Little Apartment Building on the Prairie, to demonstrate how polyphony operates in the Banlieue novel. Santaki was born in 1973 to Moroccan parents in what is now Seine-Saint-Denis, and is a journalist whose work centered on rap music, a writer, primarily of police and detective novels. La Petite Cité dans la Prairie is Santaki's first book, in which he recounts his childhood and his debut into journalism through his founding of the free magazine Five Styles, which focused on hip-hop culture and music. And he did keep that title in English. The polyphonic nature of the novel is immediately evident through its title, La Petite Cité dans la Prairie, which already calls to mind multiple cultural references. There is a series of autofictive novels by Laura Ingalls Wilder, published during the 1930s, best known by the third title in the series, Little House on the Prairie, which recounts the author's childhood experiences as her family settled the Midwest during the 1870s and 1880s. There is also the 1970s Western drama television series, Little House on the Prairie, which is based on the same novels. This television series is, surprisingly to me, particularly relevant to the French context, as it was dubbed into French and aired regularly on French television since December 1976. The TV show was so widely distributed that it became a major touchstone in French culture, as is evidenced by multiple spin-offs inspired by the show, including 2 plays, multiple songs, and even a recreation of the house from the series in Lorraine, which has become a tourist destination. Within the context of the banlieue, Little House on the Prairie repeatedly resurfaces in banlieue novels. The television-obsessed heroine, Faiza Gen's Kif Kif Demain, constantly compares her life to that of the Ingalls family. And likewise, Papa Was Not a Rolling Stone and Dumbo's Story also reference the series. Through its title alone, we already see how Santaki's polyphonic banlieue novel references multiple cultures. In this case, American, Canadian, and French, multiple genres, novels, TV series, films, theaters, and languages, both the English in which the original novels and TV show were written, and the French into which the TV show was later dubbed. And yet, through the slight modification of the title, replacing the one-word house in the French title of the series, or maison, so La Petite Maison dans la Prairie, Santaki is simultaneously reappropriating the phrase to describe his own specific context. This reappropriation is made clear in the preface, which was written by Santaki's blogger friend Bizet, in which he jokingly cautions that the book is not a sequel to the American series. Santaki also explains the title as part of his effort to counter sensationalist imagery of the banlieue. While on one level it may seem absurd to juxtapose an American frontier story with that of a young boy growing up in Seine-Saint-Denis, there are nonetheless thematic similarities which point to the stylistic power of polyphony in harmonizing seemingly disparate points of reference. The wooden cabin may have been replaced by an HLM, but the themes of growing up, settling, and finding one's space within a community remain. Furthermore, the prairie in the title evokes a theme often found in banlieue literature, that the space of the present-day banlieue used to be the very same lush green fields which were painted by the 19th century Impressionists. He reaffirms this sentiment in the closing lines of the novel, and forgive me, those of you who do not speak French. Au fond, mon quotidien ressemble beaucoup à celui de la série américaine, La petite maison dans la prairie. Je pense au générique, la gamine court dans la prairie et se casse la grêle puis se relève. Combien de fois ai-je chuté dans cette prairie? À chacune de mes nombreuses chutes, je me relève et continue à courir dans cette grande prairie qui est la vie. Through this description, he connects his own pulling himself up by his bootstrap story to the American dream that the Ingalls family is pursuing. In both cases, they got to where they were through hard work and perseverance, even in the face of significant adversity. The title is far from the only popular cultural reference in Santaki's novel. If anything, the title foreshadows the fact that references to television and music play a huge role in the narrative. For Santaki, television and music were a kind of refuge for him from reality, a way of escaping the violence of his childhood and crafting a space where he could exist away from his daily concerns. As a child, he describes taking refuge in music. It was a form of escape. Once he had his own Walkman and later MP3 player, he would deliberately select a soundtrack to his environment that matched the activity he was doing and afforded him some modicum of control in an environment where he was generally able to determine very few things in his day-to-day existence. Santaki's attention to the importance of music in shaping one's environment extends to the book itself, which is accompanied by a bande son, a soundtrack of music, that ranges from Egyptian singer Kulthum to American rap group Notorious B.I.G., to French 80s pop idol Jean-Jacques Goldman, to French rap group I.M., to American singer Barry White. Once again, we see a web of cultural references that extends past France or even Santaki's Moroccan roots. Furthermore, we see a refusal to set the banlieue entirely to a stereotypical rap soundtrack, again pointing to the diversity of the reality of life in the banlieue. Aligning himself with certain artists, songs, or television programs was also a way for Santaki to both define himself and others. He also sees himself in some movies, as is the case with both La Haine and Scarface. He repeatedly references La Haine, which he describes as the first time that he saw a film that is similar to my day-to-day life. Indeed, he is so moved by the film that the phrase "Le plus dur, ce n'est pas la chute, mais l'atterrissage" becomes a kind of personal mantra that he repeats over and over throughout the novel. At other times, the inverse happens and life imitates art, as when he decides to start doing Thai boxing following seeing the film Bloodsport. Nevertheless, he learns that despite having his head frequently in the filmic clouds, his life is never going to be a movie. And he says, "La vie est pire qu'un film, c'est une histoire d'amour déchirée par les événements." Nevertheless, Santaki expresses a much more profound mistrust of mainstream media and television reporting, particularly in the wake of the 2005 riots. Throughout the novel, fictive films and songs are repeatedly recognized as being more truthful and representative of reality than the seemingly true reporting that we see on television. This identity that is created by the films one watches, the music one listens to, the clothing one buys, the vacations one can afford to take, reigns supreme over whatever identity is inherited through racial or ethnic affiliation. While Santaki does not hide his Moroccan background, he tells the story of how his parents came from Morocco to France, and he frequently takes trips to go visit his family back in Morocco. He also does not emphasize it. He rarely dwells on questions of racial inclusion, nor does he provide racially specific descriptions of his friends or the other people they encounter, preferring instead to focus on the aspects of people identities that they do choose. When he talks about his own identity, which happens very rarely over the course of the novel, Santaki does so in a language that affirms the role of choice while dismissing clichés about the banlieue. For example, on parle de cité, de ghetto, finalement il y a beaucoup d'innocence dans le quotidien au parcours torturé. Les médias et ceux qui n'y vivent pas ont une vision de la banlieue pleine de clichés, mais pour moi, l'avenir est ici, affirming that the future is indeed there. It is clear that Santaki was seeking to write a counter-discourse, one that affirmed the power of one's own personal choices, even when one is not in the top of one's class or the best on the soccer field. Santaki is aware of the role that he is playing as a character, both as the protagonist of his own autofictive novel, but also as an Arab boy who grew up in the Banlieue, and all of the expectations that come with both roles. Like the protagonist of the TV shows and movies he so enjoys watching, or the artist he both listens to and later interviews for his magazine, he knows that he is playing a character. This kind of self-awareness, a breaking of the fourth wall, is created partially through his use of an autofictive medium. This is his biography, but as the preface suggests, it is, quote, le récit mytho, or the mythic story, with some exaggerations and omissions made for the purposes of telling a more inspirational story. Santaki is aware of the expectations placed upon him in telling the story and of the message he seeks to convey, making his stylistic and editorial choices accordingly. Fully aware of the extent to which film, music, television, and the media exploit stories like his, he takes the medium into his own hands to tweak and tell his own story on his own terms. I would like to conclude with the discussion of how this novel, as an example of the polyphonic Banlieue novel, relates both implicitly and explicitly to the questions and discourse of integration taking place in contemporary France. Integration is, without a doubt, a fraught subject, but refers most broadly to the absorption and inclusion of new immigrant populations into French society. The style of polyphony, with its seamless blending of references from multiple cultures, including the classic French canon, as well as multiple linguistic registers that show a mastery of conventional literary French, even if that style is ultimately rejected by the author, demonstrate that if the measure of integration in France is a cultural one, that is to say, the adoption of French language and literature, then the characters of the polyphonic Banlieue novel are perfectly integrated into French society. Indeed, through the web of references that they build, they demonstrate a fluidity and familiarity, not just with French sources, but also with international ones, gesturing at an ability to keep up with cultural changes that will inevitably come about as a result of globalization. Nevertheless, even as this portrait of integration is painted, there is still the affirmation of an unwillingness on the part of French culture to recognize this fact, as is represented most saliently through the inclusion of outdated Français de souche characters who cannot keep up with the demands of a globalizing France in the 21st century. Furthermore, the authors of the polyphonic Banlieue novel are quick to point their fingers at a much deeper problem of integration that extends past the adoption of the French language and cultural references to one of economic integration. Through narrative episodes that highlight the ghettoization of the Banlieue, through the paucity of economic opportunities for their inhabitants, even the well-educated culturally conversant among them. While Santaki may have had a successful life and business for himself, he is the first to admit that he was lucky in order to be able to do so. It is through exposing these elements of luck that these authors attempt to draw attention to the need for a real plan to be put into place. Their imagined literary communities as spaces of inclusion in the Banlieue are a good beginning, but they do not put bread, neither metaphorical nor literal, on the tables of most families in the Banlieue. Thank you.
Yeah, I've slightly changed my title, but still the same topic. I'm going to talk about country houses today, but it fits in with a larger project which talks about other sites of rurality in Britain, so coastlines, lakes and moorlands. But I just want to provide some sort of context before I get to the primary texts. And to start with Raymond Williams and his book, The Country in the City, which was published in 1973, and what he said about country houses. He said important parts of the country house system from the 16th to the 18th centuries were built upon the profits of imperial trade. And he, in a documentary of the same name in 1979, he mentions Tatton Hall, which he says was refurbished with colonial wealth, but he doesn't substantiate that statement, and the director of that film recalls that he couldn't find the evidence, but he was actually right. I mean, we know that now, but there wasn't that much evidence around at the time. So in 1993, Edward Said wrote his famous essay, Jane Austen and Empire, which was published in Culture and Imperialism, where, as most of you probably know all too well, he talked about Austen's novel Mansfield Park. And what he basically argued, to sort of crudely simplify, is that Austen was willfully silent about colonial cruelty and that she was largely indifferent to enslaved people's resistance to oppression. And that Austen and her contemporaries that pretty much prepared the ground for more obviously colonial writers like Kipling and Conrad. And one of his most quoted parts from that essay is, "It is genuinely troubling to see how little Britain's great humanistic ideas stand in the way of the accelerating imperial process." And one of the things that he claims, on the strength of the evidence that was available at the time, was that Austen's novel is agnostic about the extent to which slave-produced wealth funded luxurious lifestyles, and he highlights Sir Thomas Bertram's wealth in the novel, which he says makes possible his values, to which Fanny, who's of course the heroine, and Austen herself finally subscribes. Now, as we know, this was a seminal essay, and it's retained very much its status for contemporary scholars across all fields, and that's partly because of the innovations that it made, introducing contrapuntal reading and linking these literary works with cultural imperialism in the first place. But what I want to challenge a little bit is one of the essay's foundational statements, which comes in the form of a kind of exhortation. It's not the statements so much as the way that he uses history. Since Austen refers to and uses Antigua as she does in Mansfield Park, then there needs to be a commensurate effort to understand concrete the historical valences in the reference. We should try to understand what she referred to, why she gave it the importance she did, and why indeed she made the choice, for she might have done something different to establish Sir Thomas's wealth. Now, obviously, I don't want to challenge the principle of that. I couldn't agree more. But one of the things I want to talk about is how Said really underestimated country houses' ties to empire, because he wasn't privy to that knowledge at the time, and that caused him to overlook quite a lot of textual details that a sharp-eyed historian would now notice quite easily. So some of the context for what I'm talking about here is that there's so much country house research at the moment, and more Caribbean links are being recovered from the historical record than ever before. One of the books up there by Barszewski, she talks about how houses built between 1670 and the early 20th century, that up to 1 in 6 of those was purchased by merchants whose fortunes were made or depended on colonial trade. And she enumerates, with lots of other scholars sort of represented here, post-1700 houses in the countryside that were acquired around the slaving ports of Bristol, Liverpool, London and Glasgow. And people like Miranda Kaufman, who's here somewhere, have talked about how complex and multiple these houses' links are to the Caribbean. Just to give you a quick example from UCL, just across the road, it is the Hibbert family. It's talked about in the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project. So one of the things that Kate Donington points out is that over 3 generations they progressed from merchants to planters, ending up in financing the West India docks in London and lobbying Parliament against abolition, and also and interestingly, establishing themselves in the countryside where the origins of their wealth was slowly forgotten as they became associated with all these benevolent acts and donations of money, which everyone forgot where the money came from. Everyone almost, until now, had forgotten. Anyway, so that was such a brisk overview of the sorts of things that I've been reading, and one of the obvious conclusions is that historians haven't yet reflected themselves on the implications of these particular discoveries for Said's reading of Mansfield Park, and I can't resist a slight a bit of materialist criticism of it. Now, one of the things that I'm arguing in detail but haven't got time to go into here is that all this current research that I just referred to warrants a fairly definitive modification of his view on Austen. And I've only got time to quickly reassess the historical sensibility of Mansfield Park with the help of 20 years of criticism as well, before moving on to the primary text that I want to discuss. So one of the things that critics have said is that Said underestimated Austen's pro-abolitionist feeling, and that he overlooked clues like character and place names in all of Austen's novels. So that Mansfield Park references Lord Chief Justice Mansfield, who ruled that slavery was unsupported by common law. And then in Emma, you've got Mrs. Elton, who has her maiden name was Hawkins, which is the name of a nasty slaver. And then Mrs. Norris, named after another slaver. And one of the things that's been pointed out is that those characters are almost always dislikable who are associated with those names. And then you've got other critics like Marcus Wood, who said that Austen didn't deal with slave suffering because polemical writing about it was by then passé. But Austen critics have sort of come to a consensus that Austen rewards the active reader and that historical details tend to be recessed in her novels. And I just want to talk about one small detail, which just to sort of show you what I mean. You may have noticed a reference to the Lascelles family in Mansfield Park, and this is a picture of the Countess of Harewood, who married into that family. And the Lascelles built Harewood House, which was built with sugar money. And Said overlooks that reference. But obviously we know a lot about all that now. And in the novel, I don't know if you remember in Mansfield Park, that Maria Bertram takes over the Lascelles' former London residence. And in this picture, art historians are interested in the shawl that she is wearing. And it's a coveted luxury goods. And they've argued that in terms of the elaborate imperial codes of the time, that the shawl sort of covers up the unsavoury origins of the Lascelles' wealth, who were newly rich like the Bertrams. And it's sort of supposed to symbolise pedigree and respectability. Now, you'll also remember in Mansfield Park that Lady Bertram asks Fanny's brother to bring her a shawl, and Said sees this as evidence of the novel's tendency to, and I'm quoting him here, repress a rich and complex history. I mean, one of the problems with that, of course, is that he overlooks the nuances of character because she's really silly, so we're not supposed to say anything, take her seriously or identify with anything she says. But the symbolism of the shawls is that it's not just about luxury goods and from empire, but that there's this sense of anxiety about covering up the nasty origins of new wealth and also to secure a place among the landed gentry. So, I mean, I've looked at many other details such as mahogany and all little kind of material clues in the novel, but it's just one small example that goes to sort of affirm Said's idea that you should attend to historical valence, but it might lead you to a different conclusion, which is that it's not a repressed history, as Said suggests, but an oblique commentary on things like the upper class consumption of colonial goods and the desire to cover up dubious dealings, and it certainly puts Lady Bertram's request for a shawl in a bad light. So what I want to do now is to think about Said's legacy to contemporary writers, which really, again, reaffirms the value of attending to historical valence, not just because of this new historical knowledge, but because British writers are now actively rethinking English rurality in the light of this knowledge. And today I want to look at three, very briskly again, for which I apologise, distinct iterations of the literary response to Said's thoughts on Austen. And those are John Agard's a poem in his collection Mansfield Park Revisited, Joe Baker's novel Longbourn, and Catherine Johnson's novel The Curious Tale of the Lady Caribou. And I just want to take a chronological approach to show that Said's reading of Mansfield Park has influenced contemporary writers, but writers are today offering more complex and geographically wide-ranging understandings of country houses' connections to empire in response to this historical discovery, progressively more. So John Agard's poem, I think is an obvious synthesis between academic work and creative writing. You know, you've got the title Mansfield Park Revisited, which obviously references Said's rereading of Austen's novel and positions Agard's poem as a creative accompaniment to that poem. The poem's also dedicated to Said, just to make doubly sure. And then in the acknowledgement section of We Brits, he lists culture and imperialism as alongside several other, quote, eye-opening books. So what Agard's poem does is it endorses Said's contention that Mansfield Park fails to count the human cost of country houses linked to sugar wealth. And he very much affirms in that poem a belief in Austen's ambivalence and sort of shares the view that Austen provides a rather sanitised sense of country houses' colonial geographies. One of the lines there is, overseas possessions are best kept overseas. And he also inherits Said's sense that Mansfield Park is uninterested in anti-colonial resistance to enslavement. So you've got these lines, no uprising ruffles the hair under parasols. I love John Agard. And then it kind of continues this assault on cocooned upper-class sensibilities. Slave revolts are not right for polite conversation. In terms of Said's essay, this poem doesn't advance any new historical knowledge about country houses' connections to colonial trade. But what it does is it promotes Said's belief in Austen's indifference to the oppression of enslaved people. So it very much works with the grain of Said's essay, but I think it signals a really important development in literary explorations of that topic. And another line, a couple of lines for that poem, predict further literary explorations, I think, of country estates, Caribbean links along these lines, and yet then bleeding cane fields refuse to stay remote. So it's as if Said's essay has opened this Pandora's box and it's ignited this collective desire to challenge country houses' iconic heritage status. So moving on to Longbourn, it's a best-selling novel written in the Austen tradition, but it expands the horizons of another of Jane Austen's novels. It retells Pride and Prejudice from the perspective of servants, and one of those servants is a black footman based at Netherfield Hall. So the black footman is called Ptolemy, and it obviously foregrounds a slavery connection through his name. And he confirms this link when he explains plantation naming practices to a fellow servant. If you're off his estate, that's your name. That's how it works. So Ptolemy's blackness visibly attests to the unseen links between slave-produced wealth and the British economy. And the reason for this is that Jo Baker is very well versed in post-colonial Austen criticism, and her invention of this character, Ptolemy, reflects developments in the field, particularly the sense that Austen was alert to the countryside's colonial geographies and very interested in the black presence on British soil. Here's what she says about it. She says, "I just knew that the background would not be as uniformly white as represented in Austen film adaptations, and that Austen and her readers would have known this too, whereas modern readers might need it noticing for them." So she conducted very meticulous research which further justified her creation of this black footman. She discovered a reference in one of Austen's letters to a black footman of a neighbour, and that discovery augments pretty much what's already known about Austen's personal acquaintance with black people, such as Dido Bell, who she possibly met. And she also read, Baker, Ben Wilson's popular history book, Decency and Disorder, which contains several paragraphs about the historical black presence. And then she saw a television documentary about a white Scottish family who trace their ancestry back to a black servant in Paisley. And local history also played its part because she comes from Lancaster, so she was very aware from the activities of local historians that it was a former port, slave port and sugar depot. So armed with all that information and following the logic of Austen's plot, she deduced that the Bingley family might easily have made their money from sugar and were correspondingly likely to have a black servant. So this novel, I think it's useful because it's a bit of a literary milestone in high-profile reconceptualizations of country houses. And I just wanted to point out, this is a quotation from Austen, which she uses as an epigraph, quotation from Pride and Prejudice. Ptolemy's first appearance in Longbourn is given this sense of occasion, and it's sort of announced in this epigraph. And it's useful because it sort of shows what the novel's doing, which is to bring out a colonial context which is left implicit in Austen's other novels. And then just racing through, I want to talk about a third, more recent work, Catherine Johnson's young adult novel. And what this does, and how it sort of takes things further, is that it fosters the idea that British country houses are very fertile sites of black history. The plot's quite complex, but in summary, it involves the actual case of a white English woman, Mary Wilcox, who presented herself as Princess Caribou to Mrs. Worrell of Knoll Park in Gloucestershire. And the Worrells took Wilcox into their home, and the deception was discovered in 1817, and then the press reported on it widely. So she's recuperated some of that history. But what the novel does is it's set just after the 1814 publication of Mansfield Park, which again shows the sort of co-presence of Austen again. And it does various things that other works have done. So it connects country house grandeur to sugar wealth, as Austen did, as Said did, as Agard and Baker have done before her. So in Longbourn, for example, Netherfield is imagined to have sugar columns, but in this novel, Knoll Park is said to glitter like a sugar palace. But what Johnson does differently, and just takes it even further, is to introduce an East India Company element to her country house setting. So what she's doing is she's really placing rural estates more robustly in the context of the further reaches of empire, and signalling also her awareness as a writer of new country house research, because it's very much in keeping with what Margot Finn and others are doing down the road with what Finn calls the domestic turn in British imperial history, focused on country houses. The other thing that the novel does is it fairly relentlessly focuses on empire's material culture, and which is very much a hallmark of country house research today. And there are frequent casual allusions to colonial commodities, which emphasises quite how thoroughly these defined British life in the early 19th century. So you've got a naval captain drinking Jamaican rum, which is said to be straight off the boat. Mrs. Worrell creates a dainty Chinese drawing room, which is in keeping with the upper class love of chinoiserie. The daughter has a new Indian print dress. It just goes on and on and on. It's just virtually on every page there's something. And the other thing that it does is to really sharpen the post-colonial perspective on country houses, which has been emerging in academic work over the past couple of decades. And I just want to demonstrate this by quickly and finally showing you a quotation from near the end of the novel. So when the Worrell's son Fred sits on the roof, he gets this vantage point which allows him to glimpse some sort of alternative global geography. There was a view all the way down to the Bristol Channel, and even the docks. He could see a small forest of masts, so far away they could have been toothpicks, and the blue of the water stretching away to the west. So you've got here a very expansive vista which encompasses the Bristol slave port and its visiting vessels, and connects Knoll Park and houses like it, of course, to colonial maritime history and commercial trade. So I have given you a very brief overview rather than a detailed forensic investigation of these, just to give you a sense of where I'm going with it. But to conclude then, I really feel that these writers are heirs of Austen in each in their own way. And by saying heirs of Austen, I mean the way that she's been reconsidered, you know, sort of the way that her view of in Mansfield Park has been reconceptualised. But also their writing is founded on Said. So you've got Agard pretty much endorsing what Said concluded, and then Baker's novel reflecting Austen scholars' critical riposte to Said, and then Johnson, who is interested in expanding country houses' colonial geographies in the way that Said wanted to. But all of them collectively are, I think, mounting a challenge to the idea that country houses are spaces of whiteness. They're all promoting a sense of the countryside's black history as well, and I think that this is becoming increasingly strident, and I could name lots and lots of other books, plays and poems and productions that are doing the same, but I just wanted to give you 3 short examples today.